Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a refreshing break, whether you stayed in the hall and listened to Sven and his guests, or whether you did take the opportunity to stretch your legs. And welcome back as well to our online audience. So great that you are with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, after our glimpse into a promising future that we had in our keynote and also during the breakout session, let's return now to the present. And what a difference a year makes. If you think back, if you're a regular here at AMTC and you think back to 12 months ago at our meeting in Aachen, we appeared to be emerging from the pandemic. The world economy was looking set for recovery despite some persistent supply chain bottlenecks. Today, it looks pretty different, doesn't it? COVID persists, as do related supply chain disruptions. Inflation is clearly not as transitory as many people were predicting a year ago. And geopolitical tensions, notably the war in Ukraine, are spurring energy insecurity as well as shifting trade patterns, all of which, of course, were mentioned in our previous sessions. In this panel, we want to zero in and ask what all that means for the AM industry in particular. How is this cascade of crises affecting the speed of AM industrialization? Is supply chain vulnerability a problem for additive manufacturing, or does AM in fact represent a much-needed solution to the challenge? Our session is entitled Updates and Priorities, and we have an outstanding panel of international guests to answer those questions, to share best practices, and to talk about next steps. And I'm going to keep the introductions short in order to maximize our discussion time. So here to the right side of all those in the room is a perennial and very welcome guest here at AMTC. Francisco Betti is head of advanced manufacturing and production at the World Economic Forum, the WEF. Next to him is Sven Hicken. He's CTO Surface Solutions at Oerlikon. Great to see you again, Sven. Then I'm very pleased to welcome Lionel. He's head of precision engineering at the Japan-Korea desk of the Singapore Economic Development Board. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks, Melinda.
Next to him is Nicholas Deliyanakis. He is Deputy Head of Unit for Industrial Technology Strategy at the European Commission's Directorate for Research and Innovation. Wonderful that you were able to be with us today. Then we are very pleased to welcome today Kimberly Gibson. She is AM Ecosystem Director at America Makes, the cluster that has been mentioned several times today, and of course very much pushed by President Biden himself. And finally, great to have with us Felix Zimmer. He's an officer serving in the German military and working on AM with the Bundeswehr Research Institute for Materials, Fuels, and Lubricants. Really excited that you can be here. So to give all of our speakers some additional input, I want to start out by sampling the wisdom of the crowd. We will be using the digital tool on our online platform also to take your questions later on, ladies and gentlemen. But first of all, for our polling question. So please follow the instructions that you see on the screen now in order to log in. If you haven't done so yet, you can click the link in your email. Do we also have the barcode? I guess we do not now. And then use your login address that you had from your registry to go online. And I'll just give everybody a chance to do that, if you haven't done so already. And now, we're going to do a test question to check our technology. Okay, everybody ready? Our test question is, how often did you visit the Munich Wiesn? And if you haven't been to the Munich Wiesn, then you may not know that that's the Oktoberfest. I think that is known worldwide as a brand. How often did you visit the Munich Wiesn during your lifetime? And our answers are never, or one time, more than one time, or for the true regulars, every year. So let's take a look. This is essentially a way to measure how international our audience here is. And the result Yeah, the result is 38% are saying never, 23% saying one time or more than one time, and only 15% are the true hardcore Wiesen fans, and they're going every year. Thank you very much for that. Let's now go to our first serious poll question, which goes to the subject that we will be addressing in our high-level panel now, as well as later on in all of our regional sessions. And here's the question. In which region did you see the most progress on metal AM industrialization of metals in the last year? And the answer is straightforward: Europe, APAC, Americas, all, or other. Those are the answer choices, and please vote now. And I'm going to give that some time to settle because our online audience needs a bit of time to weigh in. Looks to me like we have no, still some votes coming in. Yeah. Okay, and here we go. 38% see the most progress in Europe. And then equal numbers, APAC and Americas, and 5% other. So let's get the take of our panelists on how they see that result. And Mr. Betti, would you agree that Europe is the absolute front runner here? And if so, why?
There are clearly a lot of applications in the auto space, in the aerospace, that have gone to scale, that for sure. I think that we have seen a lot of that in Europe. However, in the Americas, specifically in the US, I mean, there's a lot of progress that has been done over the past 5 years. And I'm wondering whether that result is also due to the fact that we are sitting in Europe, in Munich today, that probably confirms the need to have more visibility across continents.
Thank you so much. And let me go over to Lionel Lim, to Mr. Deliyanakis, and to Kimberly Gibson and get your take on this, whether the poll conforms to your own view or whether, as Mr. Betti so diplomatically put it, it's skewed to Europe because we're sitting in Europe. So I'll start with Lionel Lim for speaking for the Asian region.
Okay, thanks, Melinda. I think that we do see that Europe is still one of the leaders in terms of the metal AM developments, and also America is leading in the efforts. And Asia-Pac is really taking a lot of inputs from these two regions so that we can grow the industry further in Asia-Pac. I think then that's where Singapore hopefully plays a role to bring together some of these developments so that it comes together and collaborates for further future growth. And hopefully then Asia-Pac can feature even more strongly in the future.
Thank you very much. And then I'm going to jump across the Atlantic before I come back to Brussels. Kimberly Gibson, how do you see it?
I see that I tend to agree more with Mr. Betti because I see leaps and bounds of technology development, especially in the space area, as well as aerospace, new technologies coming online, and the scaling up of existing technologies, both in size and speed. So I see a lot happening, more to do, but I feel America is definitely in the mix there.
And you're going to tell us a little bit more about that later on, but let me first get Nicholas Deliyanakis' take. Clearly that's a gratifying result. Would you say it's also an accurate one?
Well, I'm not into comparisons. I will avoid a comparison, but may I use this opportunity to say how much we do in Europe to enhance commercialization of additive manufacturing. We have the Made in Europe partnership that has already invested a lot of money on specific technologies, including additive manufacturing. And when it comes to commercialization, we, in addition to underlying policy, we have the so-called European Institute of Technology, where the EIT manufacturing is working on skills and commercialization, and in fact it has started a very successful project to do precisely that, the industrialization of additive metal manufacturing, and there are already concrete examples on the ground. So I cannot do a comparison, but I know what we are doing in Europe, and it's quite a lot.
Thank you so much. Sven, if I could just go over to you and ask you where you think that we stand in general, but also here in Europe, on AM industrialization. Have you seen real progress, for example, over this past year?
Yeah, great question to all of us. How much progress we have seen? Yes, we have seen progress, several directions, printer manufacturers improving. Are we where we want to be? Not, but improvement for sure. Also, we heard in the morning about the role of education, universities. We can see that now. We have a lot of lectures, not only in Munich, all other places. So there's a growing level of understanding of the technology, and that's important for us to industrialize. So I can confirm I've seen progress.
And can you just make that a bit concrete for us in terms of progress? Which particular sectors, applications, industries you would say are really making significant steps forward? We've heard aviation mentioned a number of times.
Yeah, it was building on Kimberly's statement, space, space, space. And we are glad also to have a European contribution later on in the afternoon. But space is definitely a driver for this technology for sure. Medical always was and contains to have a huge market share. Oil and gas coming back also with all the geopolitical tensions we see. It's going up again. So it's also some industry. And for us, we can simply count it with a revenue. Yeah, it's growing, fortunately.
I'd like to talk in a little bit more detail about how the current situation, including the geopolitical situation, is affecting AM. And I'll go over here to Felix Zimmer, if I may. And of course, the Ukraine war has laid bare gaps in the German military. How do you think this will play out? And also, how is this affecting AM development for military applications? Because clearly that is the role that you are engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, there is some political part within the question. I'm not going to comment on that. But if we talk about gaps within the defense section, we talk about material readiness. To have a system ready for use. And we heard in the morning before how AM can contribute to improve availability. We can reduce the times, not the time to market, the time to have a spare part in the system. We can get rid of obsolescence if we have a major technology ready. So those are acts that basically make a supply chain more resilient. And if you think in a military and a defense environment, we always have to think about situations where supply chains are disturbed. And we do so for many years, we always do so. So there is no major difference in the way we approach to bring AM into the defense area. We want to foster the industry. We also want to bring printers within the Bundeswehr himself, because there are some military scenarios where you may want to produce a part decentralized, maybe even somewhere in the field. So it's not a major change due to the actual geopolitical situation, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people kind of changed their mind in the view on how important this actually is. And this is something in the whole, at least German, probably worldwide society that changed a lot. So I'm pretty sure that resilience and robust supply chains will be more important in the future, and AM definitely can have a significant impact on that.
Can you just speak briefly to the role that collaboration can play for you? Because clearly military parts are sensitive, industrially sensitive. Are you nonetheless collaborating with partners, including across other militaries?
Yeah, I mean, we on the one hand side definitely collaborate with the German defense industry, but if we talk about defense section, it's always the allied countries are involved. So there is a lot of exchange also on how to use AM, how to bring up, for example, military standards if needed, to have a major technology ready for the systems of all the allied partners. So we definitely do this in a national kind of way too.
And perhaps I could also ask Kimberly and Nicholas to just briefly touch on the same question, whether the Ukraine war has changed your own focus areas with regard to advanced technologies. Kimberly?
I would say that the Ukraine war has given us a real-time example of how sustainment can be done with additive at the battlefield. And, you know, we talk a lot about that, but the Ukraine war is giving us a chance to prove that. And it is happening. So I would say that's been very important, just as the coronavirus pandemic also gave us an opportunity. The Ukraine war is focusing on the sustainment of, different AM parts to keep the equipments in service.
Thank you. And also to Nicholas, the EU, of course, playing a very unusual role now since February in providing funding for defense support to Ukraine. So maybe you can talk a little bit about whether you also see AM playing into a changing focus in Europe.
Indeed, yes. So the geopolitical side is well known, and it's not my expertise anyway, but you all know about that. But I would come up with an answer very similar to Kimberly's, that the aggression against Ukraine is, as far as manufacturing is concerned, is another disruptor analogous to COVID-19. So in a way, what we are simply redoubling now what we started doing as a response to COVID-19. So amongst other things, the Union has the next generation EU funding, a huge increase in the overall budget of the Union, a lot of which has gone into research and development, and a lot of that R&D has actually gone into manufacturing. So already for COVID, we put a lot of funding into repurposing manufacturing. Of course, a lot went into vaccine development, as you know, but quite a lot also went into repurposing manufacturing, and that was on top of our usual support. So we did all that. So these crises in the context of manufacturing suggest that we have to rethink about supply chains, and that we are trying to do with the R&D in manufacturing. So, for example, we are now focusing, of course, on digitization. We always did that for other reasons, but we also focus on circularity. That will be a big theme in the work program that is about to be published next month. So this is all about making things in a more reliable and more sustainable way, but also making products that are more circular, that consume less energy. So it goes beyond manufacturing. So we have been doing a lot of that, and we are redoubling the efforts there. Also, we work a lot on energy. Energy is more important for the process industries that are, of course, energy intensive, but plays a role in manufacturing as well. So in the same work program, there is a lot of support for energy efficiency. Again, we always had that because of the need to go green, but now there is another reason for it.
Thank you. Kimberly, you wanted to comment?
I did. I neglected to mention some significant reports have come out in the United States recently with the Defense Logistics Agency, which services all of the forces, thinking about and creating rules and standards and procedures for how to deploy additively made parts, very similar to what you were saying. And in addition, the security aspects of that. How to secure defense contractor systems against all kinds of threats. And there's been a dedicated focus on that over the past few years, and some of that policy is being implemented. And so I wanted to call that out because it's very important, that kind of implementation, as the opening session shared, implementation is very important. So.
Thank you very much. If I could go over to Francisco Betti and talk about one of the other crises that have been mentioned so many times, namely supply chain disruption, or let's look at the other side of it, supply chain resilience, because there's a lot of focus on that right now. How do you see AM playing into that? I asked rhetorically, but now I'll ask it directly to you, whether the supply chain problems we've been seeing are a problem for AM, or is AM part of the solution to those disruptions?
Well, I'm convinced that technology in general can be always a solution to the problems that we are facing, and I think that AM is part of that realm of technologies that can really help companies build resiliency. But if we take a step back, I think that wide resilience is on top of the global agenda right now for every manufacturing company. I think the reason is because we are living in a war in which crises and disruptions are happening more often and with deeper consequences. That is not just the geopolitical context and ongoing conflict. It's also climate change. It's the way in which technology is developing at an accelerated space, opening new opportunities and bringing new players into every single market that may put traditional manufacturers out of business. It's because of climate change and the imperative to achieve net zero commitments and build more sustainable production and consumption models. So I think it's a combination of all that that is forcing companies to think about resilience. And we could argue that those companies that don't have a plan or have not deployed a plan, may really be at risk of being disrupted or being out of business soon. I think that where additive can really help, it's in maybe three main fronts. The first one is agility and flexibility, which is a major driver of resiliency. We saw during the COVID pandemic, right? I mean, components were missing. We needed to produce nasal swabs to be able to test millions of people. I mean, the only way to deliver those components or those very specific products at speed was through additive manufacturing, 3D printing. So it played a major role, and it has been demonstrated how it can help. Now, we could do that at scale by thinking about a broader range of components that could be produced on site instead of being shipped from multiple locations. The second area maybe is sustainability. I think we know that if we can ship powder instead of finished products which come with a lot of airspace within containers, we know if we can produce more local, we know if we can design products in a world that can be easily disassembled to enable reuse, recycling, remanufacturing, we can contribute to reducing our CO2 impact and meeting targets and goals. And then the third one, it's maybe around what we can call let's put it this way, the need to redesign the way in which we work with our suppliers. We are hearing a lot of conversations on additive manufacturing with the technology providers, those who make the machines, those who make the powders, and the OEMs. But the OEMs, in most cases in many industries, manufacture very little. So as you think about resilience, how do you drive adoption of additive manufacturing across your entire network of suppliers, those who really make the components that goes into your final products or the products you assemble? I think that's the other area in which we could see scale up further accelerating again, as we think about resiliency as a major goal and something we need to achieve.
Which essentially goes to the question of new business models as well. We're going to come to that in just a moment, but let me pose one last question related to geopolitics, and I think it's a question that is on the minds of many people. And over to Lionel Lim, if I may. We are seeing some shift, at least, out of China in connection with a diversification and regionalization that is often under the heading of resilience due to supply chains, but also, of course, due to geopolitical developments. So just talk to us briefly, if you would, about whether you nonetheless see good potential for collaboration across different regions, because there is so much concern at the moment, isn't there, about the degree to which we can still work with Asia in general, but China especially.
Okay. Thanks, Melinda. I think it's a very important question that is on the minds of everybody out there. Southeast Asia does see the outflow of some of these manufacturing investments from China benefiting Southeast Asia. And that's where I think, to Francisco's your point earlier, your point about some of this supply chain resilience, building up some of these suppliers with the capabilities. We do see that happening in and around us in Southeast Asia, where companies are also embracing more and more of additive manufacturing. This can be people like your plastics injection molding companies, your tooling companies that don't think of this in the past, but they are now using more additive manufacturing in their processes, designing products and then selling them, or rather pitching to their customers that this is the way forward as well, and we do see some of that happening. I think for geopolitical concerns, it will always remain, it has been there in the past, it will continue to remain a concern, but similar to how we have overcome the pandemic, working in a new normal, with the new constraints, things like maybe export controls or usage and licensing controls, companies and countries would think of ways to work around this a little bit and come to a new understanding, a new normal, that this is the way to collaborate moving forward. From our perspective, at least from the Singapore EDB, international collaboration is still very vibrant and it's happening all around us. This can be from the private sector, the public sector, all of them coming together. And I think where Singapore plays a role is to value add, because In the case for many of these individual countries and companies, a lot of the efforts are leading-edge efforts that are already speaking to top technology developments, where Singapore can play a role is maybe pulling together some of this into a place where open innovation is embraced. We are very open to different types of partners coming in to work together to work on these problem statements, and our ecosystem then maybe speaks to it being quite useful, given that we currently, I think, about 40% of AM capacity is in Singapore. 1/3 of the printing machines are already located in Singapore. And with Fraunhofer mentioning earlier that 10-time increase in the next 10 years for the AM industry, I think that's where there's a lot of potential. I can cite maybe very quickly 2 examples of such collaborations. One is for HP Inc. In Singapore, they have a joint lab with our Nanyang Technological University, and this is supported by a government effort, by our government agency called National Research Foundation. They take on problem statements in 3D printing, work on them, and then incorporate them into HP's own processes or in terms of serving their customers. And HP already does print their own printers. They use their 3D printing technology to do that. A second example is very much within one company, GE Aerospace. In Singapore, they have a facility that is globally certified to be the first facility to manufacture 3D print jet engine metal components and parts. And this is a collaboration between the US facility, the German facility, coming up with the design parameters, the printing parameters, and Singapore, then taking on the production side of things, bringing it to a robust and production-friendly environment.
Thank you. Doesn't get much more international than that. Thanks a lot. Let me now ask the audience to do a second poll question with us, please. And our poll question is this. Again, you're going to be voting with the online tool. What needs to be solved globally to accelerate metal AM industrialization in the next 2 years? And our potential answers are legal uncertainty, insufficient political support, lack of business models, gaps in norms and standards, unreliable technology, and reducing production costs. So a selection of potential answers for you there. Please vote, and we're going to give you a little time to weigh in on this because this is really important. We want to be sure to get an accurate picture of how the audience sees it. And dear online audience, hope you're also voting with us as we take this poll. And we will now get a look at the results. 57% see it as a classic business issue, reducing production costs, 57%. Then the second largest share of the responders sees gaps in norms and standards as a main burden. Then next largest share, unreliable technology, 14%. And after that, it drops off quite a bit. So lack of business models, 4%, and not many people believe that either legal uncertainty or political support is a real issue at this moment. Now, we do have a poll that we took last year at AMTC 2021. Let's see if we can compare that. So let's remember, production costs, big issue here, perhaps not surprising, given that we are in a very inflationary cycle at the moment. And norms and standards, 25% say that's the biggest obstacle. Can we get the results of last year's poll, please, technical team? Okay, here we see the comparison. So in 2021, unreliable printing solutions were the largest obstacle that people mentioned. So not so much costs as technology in this case. And then norms and standards comparable to here, 21% last year, 25% this year. And we also had last year a fairly large share saying they see lack of interest on the company side. We did not offer that answer this time around. And then business models got 14% last year and just 4% this year, interestingly enough. But clearly major concerns about costs. So let me now go to our panel and ask them whether they would agree with this breakdown. Francisco Betti?
Well, I mean, reduction, cost came clearly on top of the list, but I'm wondering, in line with the conversations that we are having about resiliency, there need to be more sustainable production systems, whether we got our KPIs right. because if cost optimization is the only KPI we are working towards, then I think we have a real challenge, and achieving resilient sustainability may not be possible at all, right? So I think that we need to probably look at the equation in a different way, and those are maybe questions we can bring into the survey for next year. But yes, cost, profit, margins, of course, remain a priority in business, but we may need to be looking at the implications and the impact on sustainability, resilience, workforce engagement. Is Additive transforming the experience of operators on the shop floor? I think that all that could help us come up with a much better equation.
Sustainability, of course, is also always a cost issue. And if we have proper life cycle assessment, which we're going to talk about in our last session today, then surely the cost connection, cost saving through efficiency would become clear. Sven, if you would just also give us your take, please, on that poll, and what do you think it tells us about what the AM community needs to be focusing on in the coming years?
Yeah, when I look at the results of last year and this year, for me there's a clear link between the reliability of the technology overall and the related production costs. Yeah, there is clearly a link. So we need to continue to improve the reliability. And another thought, when I reflect our experience as a service provider, what was helpful for us was to focus. And I wonder if we as a community can make also progress by defining certain areas where we as a team give more focus on. Yeah, that's the beauty of the additive technologies. It's such a wide variety of applications. That's amazing, and for engineers specifically. But the challenge is focus. And I wonder if that could also help us to make progress, as you asked before, in certain industries and applications.
Thank you. Let me jump over to Felix Zimmer and get your take on that poll. Would you agree with the concern about costs, or do you see it differently?
Well, it kind of depends on what you exactly understand with the production costs. If it's only the manufacturing process itself, then I disagree. That's, in my opinion, not the most important thing. But the overall effort that needs to be done to bring a additively manufactured product into the system, and this is typically including some kind of qualification. And that's actually where I see the most importance in. And so if I go for the poll, I'd probably have picked the norms and standards with a combination of the legal issues, even though I don't like to talk about legal issues, but basically it's about what's in a contract. Typically, you refer to any norms and standards, and the more progress we have in there and the more common understanding we have between the nations and also between the different areas we want to use it, whether it's automotive, aerospace, or the defense section, the better our common understanding is, the easier it is to use the technology, and finally we will reduce the cost that way. So, in my opinion, it's the norm and standards which should be way top.
And actually, you told me before we began that you think as industrial uptake increases, legal issues will become increasingly important. Why did you say that?
Well, because basically, the moment you have all the other problems solved, it starts to run into legal issues. No, I mean, it's because technology majority, we do have a whole bunch of technologies. Some are kind of ready from the technological level. Others need some more improvements. Same with norms and standards. In some areas, we do have a lot of norms and standards available. But what finally counts in the end is always the contracts we have between, for example, the OEM and the suppliers, or the government, whether it's defense or another section with the OEMs. So it will kind of shift into that direction. And we need to have, as much as possible, being prepared and kind of standardized, have some best practices on how to bring something into a real contract, because that's actually what defines whether money flows or not.
Thank you very much. And I saw both Kimberly and Nicholas nodding emphatically when we were talking about norms and standards and legal issues. So Kimberly, maybe you can talk a little bit about your take on the poll, but how that links up to your enthusiastic assent to what we just heard.
So thank you, Felix, for bringing that home. I think qualifications for us right now in America is one of the most critical issues. And it's the thing where we talked about focus. You're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many things to take on but we've made a decision to take on qualifications because it really is about the health of our ecosystem at the end of any day. And I have a fun fact, and I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up. I wanted to bring forth to you that according to the United States Census Bureau, 83% of metalworking facilities have 20 employees or less. Okay? In the United States, 83% have 20 employees or less. And another fact that's related is that shops with fewer than 50 employees represent 60% of US investment in metalworking technology. So, who are we dealing with? Without qualifications and supplier development, we are stuck in neutral with respect to additive. And nothing, political influence, money, nothing is going to matter until we deal with this, in my opinion. And we've tackled it head on with the President Biden's initiative called AM Forward. We're taking that head on, working with the largest suppliers and system integrators and their supply chains to try to crack this nut as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. Nicholas?
Thank you. I'll try to give one R&D answer and one policy answer. Of course, I'll try to be brief. So on the R&D front, indeed, these are well-known problems. That's exactly throughout the R&D we have been funding. The purpose has been to address production costs, standardization, reliability, and indeed the skills. So we do all that. We continue to do it. For example, our projects are asked to think about the implications for standardization of what they're doing as part of their so-called exploitation strategy. On skills, we have a very strong offering because it is both embedded in various mainstream R&D topics, but also we support it separately, upskilling in particular. We look at things like manufacturing as a service, which is meant to make advanced manufacturing, amongst other things, it's meant to make advanced manufacturing more affordable for SMEs. And more flexible. So we do all those things on the technical front. Then on the policy front, there is the interesting question of cost, which is a bit like the interesting debate about GDP. What is GDP? Do we want GDP or do we want prosperity? Similarly, you can have a similar. There is a similar debate about cost, the cost to the manufacturer, but also the cost to society of an activity. And that is very relevant to manufacturing and indeed additive manufacturing, because of course, when you promote circularity, maybe in the short term, the manufacturing may be more expensive, but ultimately the cost is lower in terms of resources, in terms of environmental damage, and so on. So there is a very interesting question about cost. Of course, from the point of view of a small company, it's very simple and it's a brutal question. But from the point of view of a policymaker and in terms of devising priorities, it is a broader question.
And Nicholas, if I can just, sorry, interrupt you there, but I do have a question from the audience that asks about the European Union's policy initiatives that would be comparable to AM Forward in the United States, asking whether the European Commission essentially can match that with its own initiatives.
Yes and no. The answer is no if you want to know whether there is direct support. And the reason for that is that there was a lot of direct support whilst we were still looking at individual technologies. And now, as I was outlining earlier, there is support for the manufacturing system as a whole, including additive manufacturing. So if you look at our topics, you will see a shift from not away from technologies, but away from an explicit mention of particular technologies and towards outcomes that are desirable both for companies and for society at large. So additive manufacturing is a must in all these things. You may not see it so often by name, if that is what you want to know. So if you ask me how much money is going into additive manufacturing now, I could not tell you because we don't have dedicated topics. I could tell you how much is going into advanced manufacturing and related areas. So I don't have a complete answer, but I hope that the answer is still an encouraging one.
And let me go to Lionel also for comment on that poll result that we saw, but I'd like to link it up, if I may, also to another audience question that has come in, which essentially goes to that link between a holistic, sustainability-oriented view and cost savings. So can you speak to both of those, remembering again that the largest share of the audience thought that high cost is in fact the biggest obstacle at the moment?
Okay, so I think based on the poll earlier, there were two things that came up. So high cost is one, and the other one is standards. And from a Singapore perspective, what we look at is using the standards to drive AM developments, and in so doing, that can potentially reduce the cost in the future. Because when you set the parameters, when you set the standards for additive manufacturing, you know what you're in for, you know what you need to do to get to that state. Then that's where I think companies would end up wasting less resources, duplicative efforts to go and do too many different things that may not result in the end state that the industry requires. So for that, at least from a Singapore perspective, what we did was to concentrate, I think similar to America makes, we are looking at standards setting, standards development, which is why we have companies like ASTM, Toothsuit, Underwriters Laboratories working with us, not only the Singapore government, but with the industries that are in Singapore to really set and develop the standards that are needed for additive manufacturing, whether it's marine and offshore, aerospace, or different sectors. That holistic view and trying to reduce cost, one thing that we did was to, Singapore is a small country, so it's easy to coordinate efforts as compared to other larger countries and regions. What we did was to have a national body. We set up, it's called National Additive Manufacturing Innovation Cluster, a little bit similar to the MOU signing earlier, where we bring together all the different parties in Singapore. And it's not only at the academia or the large companies, but we bring in the SMEs as well to be participating in solving problem statements. And a lot of these are related to cost elements. We can get our research institutes which have government funding or research grant calls that are put out there to resolve some of these cost issues, performance issues through the work that NAMIC itself can coordinate and bring together different parties to resolve.
Thank you. Very interesting indeed. One last audience question, if I may. Perhaps I'll address it to Francisco, Betti, and Sven, but with the request, if you would, for short answers. Here's the question. It got a lot of likes from our audience. Do hidden champions drive industrialization when processes and materials improvements are a trade secret to supply parts within existing production systems, or is it the big global players? Shall I read it off again? It's a complex question, but did you get the sense of it?
It's definitely a long one. Sorry, okay. It's about the materials, components, and whether those are owned by global players or if we have an open market.
It's essentially whether hidden champions, in other words, SMEs and or smaller companies are driving industrialization on when process and materials improvements are in fact a trade secret. This is how I understand it, or where it's the biggest, or whether it's the big global players who are really driving.
And it's probably a combination of both. I mean, the fact that we have all these amazing companies, supporting this conference is a sign that there's a willingness to open up, collaborate, and bring as many, not just of the large companies, but as many of their suppliers on board in this journey. But I think that, and I have seen that with all sorts of technologies, very often most amazing applications comes from the small shops, right? You were saying it's 20 people per shop in the US as an average, working on metal shops. So I think that I'm not surprised if most of those applications are initially coming from those very small realities, but then the question is how do we scale them, how do we replicate them? And that requires an ecosystem, that requires collaboration, that requires opening up. I think that Mikael was saying this morning, we need more collaboration. We can't be thinking about additive as the next, let's say, key competitive advantage. I mean, it's an ecosystem play, and that's really the approach we need to take if we really want to scale it.
Yeah. Thank you. Sven?
Yeah, I only can echo your statement. It's definitely a combination. It's a hidden champion. It's always a pleasure to see some surprises, positive surprise, say, wow, I would not have assumed they've developed a certain application to that level. But exactly what you stated, to roll it out on a global scale, it needs the global players. with their related ecosystems. So the clear answer is we need both. We are happy to have both to drive the industrialization.
Thank you so much to all of you for these very, very interesting perspectives. A lot of consensus, I think, about both where we stand now, where the potential is, but also what we need to move forward on in order to really achieve the upscaling that all of you are looking for. So let's give them a warm round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much.